The Gypsy Rose Blanchard story, on June 14, 2015, concerned friends and neighbors gathered outside a small pink house in Springfield, Missouri. 4 days, they'd been unable to reach Dee Dee Blanchard and her daughter Gypsy Rose. The posts on Gypsy's Facebook account had been disturbing and out of character. Something was very wrong. When police finally entered the home, they found Dee Dee Blanchard lying in her bedroom, stabbed to death. But her daughter Gypsy, the wheelchair-bound, chronically ill young woman who Dee Dee had devoted her life to caring for, was nowhere to be found. Had she been kidnapped? Was she in danger? The community feared the worst. What police discovered in the following days would shock the nation and challenge everything we think we know about victims, abusers, and the nature of love itself. This is not a simple story of murder. It's not a straightforward tale of good versus evil. This is the story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, a young woman who spent her entire childhood trapped in a web of lies, subjected to unnecessary surgeries, confined to a wheelchair she didn't need, and convinced she was dying from diseases she never had. It's the story of Dee Dee Blanchard, a mother who appeared to be a saint, sacrificing everything for her sick daughter, but who was actually the architect of one of the most disturbing cases of medical child abuse ever documented. And it's the story of how years of abuse, desperation, and a forbidden online romance culminated in a brutal murder that would force us to ask uncomfortable questions. Can a victim also be a criminal? Where does sympathy end and accountability begin? And what happens when the person who loves you most is also your greatest tormentor? Gypsy Rose Blanchard was born on July 27, 1991, in Golden Meadow, Louisiana. Her mother, Claudine Dee Dee Blanchard, was 24 years old. Her father, Rod Blanchard, was only 17. The young couple's relationship didn't last long. Rod and Dee Dee separated before Gypsy was born, though Rod remained involved in his daughter's life, paying child support and maintaining regular contact. By all early accounts, Gypsy was a normal, healthy baby. But when she was around 3 months old, Dee Dee began taking her to doctors with concerns about sleep apnea. It was the beginning of a medical odyssey that would consume Gypsy's entire childhood and beyond. As Gypsy grew, so did the list of her supposed ailments. Dee Dee claimed her daughter had muscular dystrophy, requiring a wheelchair. She said Gypsy had seizures, necessitating multiple medications. She reported learning disabilities and developmental delays that meant Gypsy had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old, even as she grew into her teens. She said Gypsy had leukemia and had undergone chemotherapy, which explained why her hair fell out and why she sometimes wore wigs. The medical conditions kept multiplying. Asthma. Vision problems requiring glasses. Hearing problems requiring a hearing aid. Allergies to sugar, which meant Gypsy needed a feeding tube. Chromosomal defects. The list went on and on, a catalogue of suffering that painted Gypsy as one of the unluckiest children alive. Dee Dee became her daughter's full-time caretaker, advocate, and voice. She spoke for Gypsy at medical appointments. She answered questions on her behalf. She managed all her medications, her feeding tube, her wheelchair. To the outside world, Dee Dee was a devoted mother, sacrificing her own life to care for her desperately ill child. And people loved her for it. The community rallied around them. Habitat for Humanity built them a specially designed house with wheelchair ramps and accessible features. The Make-A-Wish Foundation sent them on trips to Disney World, multiple times. Charities paid for medical equipment. Strangers donated money. Local news stations featured them in heartwarming stories about a mother's love and a daughter's courage. Dee Dee and Gypsy attended conventions and events for chronically ill children. They were photographed at celebrity meet and greets. They received VIP treatment at theme parks. Miranda Lambert, the country music star, met them and was so moved that she invited them to concerts and stayed in touch. Gypsy played her part perfectly. She sat in her wheelchair, speaking in a high-pitched, childlike voice. She smiled sweetly for photos. She wore princess costumes and colorful wigs. She seemed younger than her years, innocent and vulnerable. People saw her and wanted to help, wanted to make her life a little brighter, wanted to ease the burden on the saintly mother who cared for her so devotedly. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, a very different reality was unfolding. Rod Blanchard, Gypsy's father, had concerns from early on. He lived in Louisiana while Dee Dee and Gypsy moved around, eventually settling in Missouri. Rod paid child support faithfully and visited when he could, but Dee Dee controlled access to Gypsy. When Rod asked questions about Gypsy's medical conditions, Dee Dee provided vague answers or changed the subject. When he asked to speak to doctors directly, Dee Dee made excuses. Dee Dee's own family also had suspicions. Her mother and stepfather noticed inconsistencies in Dee Dee's stories. They saw Gypsy walk when Dee Dee wasn't looking. They noticed that the medications and diagnoses seemed to change frequently. But when they raised concerns, Dee Dee would become defensive or simply cut off contact, moving to a new location and limiting communication. The truth was that Gypsy Rose Blanchard was not sick. She never had muscular dystrophy, leukemia, chromosomal disorders, or most of the other conditions Dee Dee claimed. She could walk. Her cognitive development was normal. She didn't need a feeding tube or most of the medications she was given. Dee Dee Blanchard was suffering from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a psychiatric disorder in which a caregiver, usually a parent, fabricates or induces illness in someone under their care to gain attention, sympathy, and sometimes financial benefits. It's a form of child abuse that's particularly insidious because the abuser appears to be a devoted caregiver while actually causing tremendous harm. How did Dee Dee maintain this deception for so long? She was skilled at manipulating medical professionals. She doctor shopped, taking Gypsy to multiple physicians and specialists in different cities and states. When one doctor became skeptical, she'd simply find another. She claimed medical records had been destroyed in Hurricane Katrina, making it difficult for doctors to verify previous diagnoses. She was knowledgeable about medical terminology and symptoms, able to describe conditions convincingly. She also isolated Gypsy from anyone who might expose the truth. Dee Dee homeschooled Gypsy, claiming her illnesses made regular school impossible. She monitored all of Gypsy's interactions with others. She spoke for Gypsy in public, explaining that her daughter was shy or that speaking was difficult for her. She moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough for people to notice inconsistencies. And she used fear to control Gypsy. From a young age, Gypsy was told she was sick, that without her mother's care she would die, that the outside world was dangerous. Dee Dee allegedly tied Gypsy to her bed with a dog leash when she misbehaved. She controlled what Gypsy ate, what she wore, who she could talk to, what she could watch on television. She shaved Gypsy's head to maintain the appearance of chemotherapy side effects. She forced Gypsy to use a wheelchair even though she could walk. Gypsy grew up believing she was dying. She took medications that made her feel sick, validating her mother's claims about her illnesses. She underwent unnecessary medical procedures, including multiple surgeries. Her teeth rotted and had to be removed, possibly due to medications or neglect, leaving her with dentures as a teenager. But as Gypsy grew older, she began to realize something was wrong. She started to understand that she wasn't as sick as her mother claimed. She tried to walk when her mother wasn't looking. She questioned why she needed certain medications. And most dangerously, she began to want a life of her own. In 2011, Gypsy tried to run away with a man she'd met at a science fiction convention. Dee Dee found out and dragged her back home. She destroyed Gypsy's computer and cell phone. She told neighbors and friends that Gypsy was having problems because of her medications, that she was confused and didn't understand reality. She tightened her control, making escape seem impossible. Gypsy was trapped. She was a prisoner in her own home, in her own body, in her own life. Her mother controlled everything, loved her obsessively, and was slowly destroying her. And the rest of the world saw only a devoted mother and her tragically ill daughter. But Gypsy was more capable than anyone realized. And she was about to find an escape route that would lead to freedom, but at a terrible cost. Despite Dee Dee's efforts to control every aspect of Gypsy's life, she couldn't control everything. In 2012, Gypsy secretly created an online profile on a Christian dating website. She was 21 years old, though she'd been told she was several years younger and acted the part of a child in public. Online, Gypsy could be herself. She could type without her mother hovering. She could express thoughts and feelings she'd never been allowed to share. And crucially, she could talk to people who didn't know her as the sick girl in the wheelchair. For the first time in her life, she experienced a taste of freedom. That's where she met Nicholas Goad John. Nick, as he was called, was a young man from Big Bend, Wisconsin, with his own complicated history. He'd been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and had struggled socially throughout his life. He was isolated, lonely, and spent much of his time online in fantasy role-playing communities. Gypsy and Nick began chatting, first on the dating site, then moving to other platforms. Their relationship quickly became intense. For Gypsy, Nick represented escape, freedom, and love. For Nick, Gypsy was someone who accepted him, needed him, and made him feel important. They engaged in explicit online sexual conversations, exploring desires that Gypsy had been forbidden to even acknowledge. They fell in love, or at least what they believed was love. In reality, their relationship was built on fantasy, desperation, and mutual need rather than genuine understanding or healthy connection. But for two isolated, damaged young people, it felt real and powerful. In 2013, Nick traveled to Springfield to meet Gypsy in person for the first time. They arranged a secret meeting at a movie theater while Dee Dee was distracted. It was Gypsy's first real date, her first kiss, her first sexual experience. For a few hours, she was just a normal young woman with a boyfriend, not a sick child under her mother's total control. But Dee Dee discovered the meeting. Gypsy had made the mistake of leaving evidence on a computer. Dee Dee was furious and terrified that her carefully constructed world was crumbling. She smashed Gypsy's computer and destroyed any devices that could connect her to the outside world. She told Gypsy that men only wanted one thing, that Nick would hurt her, that the outside world was dangerous. Yet somehow, Gypsy managed to maintain secret contact with Nick. She found ways to access the internet when Dee Dee wasn't watching. They continued their online relationship, their conversations growing more intense and more desperate. Gypsy began talking about wanting to escape, about running away to be with Nick. But Dee Dee was never going to let Gypsy go. Gypsy understood this on a fundamental level. Her mother would never allow her to grow up, to be independent, to have her own life. Dee Dee's entire identity was wrapped up in being the devoted mother of a sick child. Without that role, Dee Dee was nothing. And Dee Dee would rather die than lose it. Or rather, Dee Dee would rather Gypsy died. This is where the story takes its darkest turn. In their online conversations, Gypsy began to talk about how impossible her situation was. Nick, who existed in a world of fantasy role-playing and lacked the social skills to understand the real-world implications of their discussions, began suggesting solutions. The conversations evolved over time. They talked about running away together. But where would they go? How would they survive? Dee Dee would report Gypsy as a kidnapped victim. She'd tell authorities that Gypsy was mentally disabled and couldn't make decisions for herself. She'd find them and bring Gypsy back. They talked about Gypsy just leaving. But Gypsy had no money, no identification, no real-world skills. Dee Dee had made sure of that. Gypsy couldn't even legally prove who she was. Dee Dee had forged documents, claiming Gypsy was younger than she actually was. And so, gradually, terrifyingly, their discussions turned to murder. It started as fantasy, the kind of dark thoughts that desperate people sometimes entertain but never act upon. But for Gypsy and Nick, isolated from reality and feeding each other's delusions, the fantasy began to feel like the only solution. Gypsy later claimed that Nick suggested killing Dee Dee. Nick later claimed that Gypsy manipulated him into it. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. What's certain is that over months of online conversation, they planned Dee Dee's murder. They researched methods. They discussed timing. Gypsy sent Nick photos of her house, showing him the layout. They created a fantasy narrative around the killing, with Nick adopting an alter ego he called Victor, an evil personality who would do what Nick himself couldn't. This dissociative fantasy allowed them both to distance themselves psychologically from what they were planning. In early June 2015, the plan crystallized. Nick would take a bus from Wisconsin to Springfield. Gypsy would let him into the house late at night. He would kill Dee Dee while she slept. Then Gypsy and Nick would take the money Dee Dee kept hidden in the house and run away together to start a new life. Looking back, it's clear that neither of them fully understood what they were planning. They existed in a fantasy world, shaped by online role-playing, desperate wishes, and a complete disconnect from reality. They seemed to believe they could kill Dee Dee and then simply live happily ever after, as if murder was just an obstacle to overcome rather than a crime with devastating consequences. On June 9, 2015, Nicholas John arrived in Springfield. The date had been chosen carefully. It was after Gypsy's actual birthday, though Dee Dee had told everyone Gypsy was celebrating her birthday the next month, maintaining the deception about her daughter's age even in something as simple as a birthday. Gypsy and Nick exchanged messages. Everything was in place. Dee Dee suspected nothing. The plan was about to become horrifyingly real. The evening of June 9, 2015, started like any other evening in the Blanchard household. Dee Dee and Gypsy were home together in their pink house on West Volunteer Way. Dee Dee had no idea that Nicholas Gojon was in Springfield, that he'd traveled hundreds of miles to carry out the plan they'd been discussing for months. Around midnight, when Dee Dee was asleep in her bedroom, Gypsy quietly let Nick into the house. They'd been messaging throughout the evening, coordinating the timing. Nick brought with him a knife, gloves, and duct tape. These weren't impulsive choices. These were premeditated preparations for murder. According to later testimony, Gypsy hid in the bathroom while Nick entered Dee Dee's bedroom. She would later say she covered her ears because she didn't want to hear what was about to happen. She wanted her mother dead, but she didn't want to witness it. Even after years of abuse, even in the act of arranging her mother's murder, Gypsy's feelings were complicated and conflicted. Nick stabbed Dee Dee multiple times while she slept. The medical examiner would later determine that Dee Dee had been stabbed 17 times in the back. It was a brutal, frenzied attack. Dee Dee likely woke during the assault, realized what was happening, but was unable to defend herself or call for help. The killing wasn't quick or clean like they might have imagined in their online fantasies. It was violent, messy, and real. Blood soaked the bed and walls. The reality of what they'd done was impossible to ignore. After the murder, Gypsy and Nick had sex in Gypsy's bedroom, mere feet from where Dee Dee's body lay cooling. This detail shocked many people when it came to light during the investigation and trial. How could someone do that immediately after murdering their mother? The answer reveals just how disconnected from normal reality both Gypsy and Nick were. For them, this was the culmination of their online fantasy romance. They'd slain the dragon, rescued the princess, and now they were celebrating their freedom. The moral weight of what they'd done hadn't yet registered. They took $4,000 in cash that Dee Dee had kept hidden in the house, money that had come from the charity and disability benefits Dee Dee had fraudulently obtained. They also took Gypsy's medications, laptop, and a few other items. Then they called a taxi to take them to a bus station. Before leaving, they made one more stop. They went to a movie theater and watched a film, Cinderella, sitting in the dark theater like a normal couple on a date. It was surreal, a moment of normalcy sandwiched between murder and flight. For Gypsy, who'd been to very few movies in her life, it may have felt like the freedom she'd been dreaming of. For those few hours, she wasn't thinking about what she'd done or what would come next. Then they boarded a bus headed for Wisconsin. The plan was to go to Nick's parents' house, though what they thought would happen after that is unclear. Did they really believe they could just disappear and start a new life? Did they think no one would look for Gypsy? They seemed to exist in a fantasy where consequences didn't apply to them. Meanwhile, in Springfield, Dee Dee's body lay undiscovered in her bedroom. Days passed. June 10th, June 11th, June 12th. The house sat quiet, the windows dark. But then, on June 14th, something bizarre happened that would ultimately lead to their arrest. Someone posted on Gypsy's Facebook page. The message read, "That bitch is dead," followed by more explicit and disturbing text. Gypsy's Facebook friends saw these posts and were immediately alarmed. This didn't sound like Gypsy at all. Was she having a breakdown? Had someone hacked her account? Was she in danger? They tried calling, but no one answered. They contacted each other, sharing their concerns. Neighbors also became worried. They hadn't seen Dee Dee or Gypsy in days, which was unusual. The house looked empty. Several people called the police for a welfare check. When officers arrived at the house on West Volunteer Way, they found it locked with no signs of forced entry. They knocked and called out, but received no response. Given the concerning Facebook posts and the fact that a supposedly severely disabled person might be inside without her caregiver, they decided to enter the home. Inside, they found what they'd feared but also something they never expected. Dee Dee Blanchard was dead in her bedroom, clearly the victim of a violent homicide. But Gypsy, the wheelchair-bound, chronically ill young woman who everyone believed couldn't survive without constant care, was gone. Her wheelchair sat empty. Where was she? Had she been kidnapped? Was she also dead, her body hidden somewhere else? The investigation began immediately. Detectives processed the crime scene, photographed the body, collected evidence. They interviewed neighbors who described Dee Dee as a devoted mother and Gypsy as a severely disabled young woman. The natural assumption was that Gypsy was a victim, perhaps kidnapped by whoever killed her mother. But then investigators looked at Gypsy's Facebook account more closely. They traced the IP address of the disturbing posts. The messages had been sent from Wisconsin, from the area where Nicholas Gojon lived. Detectives began digging into Gypsy's online activity. They discovered her secret accounts, her relationship with Nick, the thousands of messages between them. And in those messages, they found discussions about killing Dee Dee, plans for the murder, and evidence that Gypsy wasn't a victim of kidnapping at all. She was a conspirator. On June 15, 2015, police in Wisconsin located Gypsy and Nick at his parents' house. When officers arrived, they found something that shocked them. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was not in a wheelchair. She was walking, talking normally, and appeared to be in good health. Everything they'd been told about her being severely disabled was false. When questioned, both Gypsy and Nick initially tried to maintain aspects of their fantasy. But faced with physical evidence and the reality of their situation, they began to talk. Nick admitted to killing Dee Dee. Gypsy admitted to planning it with him. As the full story emerged, the case became national news, not just because of the murder, but because of what investigators discovered about Gypsy's life. Medical records were subpoenaed. Doctors were interviewed. The truth about Dee Dee's deception and abuse came to light. Gypsy Rose Blanchard, the severely ill child who'd inspired charity and compassion from thousands of people, didn't have muscular dystrophy, leukemia, or most of the other conditions her mother had claimed. She'd been the victim of one of the most extreme cases of Munchausen syndrome by proxy ever documented. And in her desperation to escape that abuse, she conspired to kill the abuser. The public's reaction was immediate and divided. Was Gypsy a victim or a criminal? Both? Neither. The case forced people to confront uncomfortable questions about abuse, autonomy, desperation, and the limits of victimhood. The legal proceedings in the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case were complex and unprecedented. How do you prosecute someone who committed murder while being held prisoner and systematically abused by the victim? How do you balance justice for the murder against compassion for years of suffering? Nicholas John was charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. His case went to trial in November 2018. The prosecution argued that Nick had traveled to Missouri with a specific intent to kill Dee Dee Blanchard, that he'd brought weapons, that he'd committed a brutal, premeditated murder. They presented evidence of the planning, the messages between Nick and Gypsy, and the violence of the attack itself. The defense argued that Nick had autism spectrum disorder, that he was manipulated by Gypsy, and that he didn't fully understand the consequences of his actions. They painted Nick as someone living in a fantasy world, unable to distinguish between online role-playing and reality. They suggested that Gypsy had used Nick as a weapon, exploiting his mental health issues and his desire to be her hero. Expert witnesses testified about Nick's mental state. Some argued he understood right from wrong and was capable of forming criminal intent. Others suggested his autism and other mental health issues impaired his judgment significantly. The jury heard about the alter ego Victor that Nick had created, the violent fantasy persona who would do things Nick himself supposedly couldn't. Was this evidence of dissociative identity disorder, or was it just role-playing that got out of hand? After deliberating, the jury found Nicholas John guilty of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. In February 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge showed no mercy, stating that the murder was planned, brutal, and that Nick had made a conscious choice to take another person's life. Nick is currently serving his sentence at the Potosi Correctional Center in Missouri. He's filed appeals, but they've been unsuccessful. He will likely spend the rest of his life in prison for his role in Dee Dee's murder. Gypsy's case was very different. She was charged with second-degree murder, a lesser charge than first-degree, reflecting prosecutors' recognition of her unique circumstances. But she still faced serious prison time. Gypsy's attorneys faced a challenging task. Yes, their client had been horrifically abused. Yes, she'd been held prisoner and manipulated her entire life. Yes, she'd undergone unnecessary surgeries and been forced to take medications that made her sick. But she'd also planned her mother's murder and carried out that plan. She hadn't wielded the knife, but she'd orchestrated the killing and provided access to the victim. The defense had to balance presenting Gypsy as a victim deserving of compassion while also acknowledging her role in a serious crime. They needed to explain how someone could be so damaged by abuse that murder seemed like the only escape, while also accepting responsibility for that choice. Ultimately, Gypsy decided to accept a plea deal rather than go to trial. In July 2016, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. In exchange for the plea, prosecutors recommended a 10-year prison sentence. At her sentencing hearing, Gypsy addressed the court. She expressed remorse for her mother's death. She acknowledged that what she'd done was wrong, that there were other options she could have pursued, that taking a life was never justified. But she also described years of abuse, the isolation, the medical procedures, the control. "I feel like I'm free," she said, even knowing she was about to be sent to prison. "For the first time in my life." The statement encapsulated the tragedy of the case. Prison, with its restrictions and rules, felt like freedom compared to life with Dee Dee Blanchard. That comparison spoke volumes about the severity of the abuse Gypsy had endured. The judge sentenced Gypsy to 10 years in prison, as recommended in the plea deal. She would be eligible for parole after serving 85% of her sentence. She was sent to the Chillicothe Correctional Center in Missouri. The sentences prompted intense public debate. Many people felt Gypsy's punishment was too harsh, arguing she was a victim who'd been driven to desperation. They pointed to cases where women who killed abusive partners received lighter sentences or were acquitted based on self-defense or battered woman syndrome. Others argued the sentence was appropriate, noting that Gypsy had other options available. She could have told doctors the truth about her condition. She could have contacted her father or other family members. She could have gone to police. Instead, she'd chosen murder. And while her circumstances were extraordinary, the law couldn't simply excuse killing another person. Some legal experts noted that Gypsy's case didn't fit neatly into traditional self-defense frameworks. She wasn't in immediate danger when Dee Dee was killed. Dee Dee was asleep, unaware, vulnerable. This wasn't a spontaneous act to prevent imminent harm. It was premeditated, planned over months. That made it legally more difficult to argue for a lighter sentence, regardless of the abuse. The case also raised questions about Munchausen syndrome by proxy and how the legal system should handle such situations. What responsibility do medical professionals have to detect this kind of abuse? What should the consequences be for those who enable or fail to stop it? Several doctors who treated Gypsy over the years faced scrutiny. How had so many medical professionals been deceived? Were there warning signs they missed? Should they have been more suspicious of Dee Dee's claims? The answer is complicated. Munchausen by proxy is rare and difficult to detect, especially when the perpetrator is as skilled as Dee Dee was. She doctor-shopped, moved frequently, and claimed that records had been lost. She presented as a devoted, knowledgeable caregiver. Many doctors saw them only once or twice before Dee Dee moved on to someone else. Some medical professionals did express concerns. At least one doctor questioned whether Gypsy really had muscular dystrophy. But when doctors raised questions, Dee Dee simply found new providers who were less skeptical. And without a centralized medical record system or coordination between different healthcare providers, the pattern of abuse was hard to spot. The case led to discussions about improving medical protocols for detecting factitious disorder imposed on another, the clinical term for Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Should there be better systems for flagging patients who see multiple doctors for the same conditions? Should there be more training for healthcare providers on recognizing signs of medical child abuse? It also prompted discussions about disability fraud and the systems that Dee Dee exploited. She'd received disability benefits, charity donations, and community support based on lies. Should there be better verification processes? How do we balance helping those in genuine need with preventing fraud? These are difficult questions without easy answers. Tightening restrictions could make it harder for people who genuinely need help to receive it. But lax oversight allows cases like the Blanchards to go undetected for years. Gypsy Rose Blanchard's time in prison was radically different from her life with Dee Dee, and in many ways, significantly better. For the first time in her life, she had autonomy. She could make choices about what to eat, what to wear, who to talk to. She wasn't being forced to take medications she didn't need. She wasn't being subjected to unnecessary medical procedures. She wasn't being told she was dying. In prison, Gypsy learned to read properly, something Dee Dee had never adequately taught her. She participated in educational programs. She made friends. She started to understand herself and process the trauma she'd experienced. She received actual mental health treatment from professionals who understood her situation. Perhaps most significantly, she could be her actual age. For years, Dee Dee had told people Gypsy was younger than she was, forcing her to act like a child even as she grew into adulthood. In prison, Gypsy could finally just be herself, a young woman in her 20s rather than an eternal child. Gypsy's story attracted significant media attention. In 2017, HBO released a documentary called Mommy Dead and Dearest that examined the case in detail. The film featured interviews with Gypsy from prison, her father Rod, prosecutors, investigators, and others involved in the case. It presented a nuanced look at the complexity of the situation. The documentary sparked renewed public interest and sympathy for Gypsy. Many viewers saw her not as a murderer, but as a victim who'd been driven to desperate measures. Online petitions calling for her early release gathered thousands of signatures. In 2019, Hulu released The Act, a dramatic miniseries based on the case. The show starred Joey King as Gypsy and Patricia Arquette as Dee Dee. While fictionalized and dramatized for television, the series introduced the case to an even wider audience. Patricia Arquette won an Emmy for her portrayal of Dee Dee, bringing attention to the disturbing nature of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. The Act portrayed Dee Dee with complexity, showing her not just as a monster, but as a woman with her own psychological issues and possibly her own traumatic background. It depicted Gypsy's growing awareness that something was wrong and her increasing desperation to escape. The show generated intense discussion about abuse, victimhood, and the criminal justice system. Gypsy herself had mixed feelings about the media attention. She appreciated that her story was being told and that people were learning about Munchausen syndrome by proxy. But she also found it painful to see her life dramatized, to watch actresses portray the worst moments of her existence, to have her trauma become entertainment. In prison, Gypsy maintained contact with her father, Rod Blanchard. Rod, who'd been mostly absent from Gypsy's life due to Dee Dee's manipulation and control, reconnected with his daughter. He visited her regularly, wrote letters, and became an advocate for her eventual release. He publicly stated that while he didn't excuse what Gypsy had done, he understood why she'd felt it was her only option. Rod also spoke about his own guilt and regret. He'd paid child support faithfully and tried to be involved in Gypsy's life, but he believed Dee Dee's lies about Gypsy's illnesses. He'd sent money for medical expenses, assuming his daughter was genuinely sick. Looking back, he saw warning signs he'd missed or dismissed. He carried the weight of wondering if he could have done more to save Gypsy from years of abuse. Gypsy's relationship with Dee Dee's family was more complicated. Some of Dee Dee's relatives defended her, arguing she genuinely believed Gypsy was sick or that she'd had good intentions even if her methods were wrong. Others acknowledged that Dee Dee had serious psychological problems and that what she did to Gypsy was abuse, even if they mourned her death. The complexity of Gypsy's feelings about her mother became a central part of her story. Despite everything Dee Dee had done, despite the years of abuse and control, Gypsy still loved her mother in some way. She expressed genuine remorse about Dee Dee's death. She said she wished things could have been different, that she could have escaped without violence, that her mother could have gotten help. This is a common dynamic in abuse cases. Abusers are often complex people who genuinely love their victims in their own twisted way. Dee Dee probably did love Gypsy, but that love was possessive, controlling, and ultimately destructive. And victims often love their abusers despite the harm they've suffered, creating painful internal conflicts that can last a lifetime. In prison, Gypsy also had to deal with the reality of what she'd done. She'd arranged for her mother's brutal murder. Regardless of the abuse she'd suffered, a person had died violently because of her actions. Processing that guilt and responsibility while also working through trauma is extraordinarily difficult psychological work.